At 4 a.m., I heard a generator running on my own property. I grabbed a flashlight, walked out to my reservoir, and found the HOA president standing knee-deep in my water, running a hose straight into her own truck. She didn't even hear me coming. And what happened over the next 3 weeks cost her everything she thought her position protected. If you love watching entitled HOA tyrants get exactly what's coming to them, subscribe now. Because this story ends with a woman who thought she was untouchable losing her home over stolen water. I built that reservoir myself 3 years before any of this happened. 14 acres of land I'd bought specifically because it had natural water rights attached, a small spring-fed pond that had been on the property deed for decades, completely separate from the municipal system the HOA subdivision next door relied on. I wasn't part of that HOA. Never had been. My property sat just outside their boundary line, close enough that the subdivision's back fence practically touched my property line, but legally completely separate. Different water rights. Different everything. That distinction mattered more than I ever could have imagined. The drought hit that summer harder than anyone expected. Water restrictions across the county tightened week by week. No lawn watering, no pool refills, no car washing, the kind of restrictions that make an entitled neighborhood absolutely miserable. I didn't think much about it. My reservoir was legally mine, fed by a natural spring, completely unaffected by municipal restrictions. I watered my garden. I filled my animals' troughs. I lived exactly like I always had because none of the county's rules applied to my private water source. I had no idea that fact had already made me a target. It started small. I noticed my water level dropping faster than it should have during a dry spell. Not dramatically, just enough to make me double-check the spring's flow rate, wondering if the drought was somehow affecting even my private source. Then I noticed tire tracks. Fresh ones, cutting through the grass near the reservoir's edge, in a spot nobody had any reason to drive through except me. I mentioned it to a neighbor down the road, an older guy who'd lived in the area for decades. He laughed, but not because he thought it was funny. "That'll be someone from Ridgemont Estates," he said, nodding toward the HOA subdivision behind my property. "Heard their restrictions are brutal this summer. Wouldn't put it past some of them to get creative." I brushed it off at first. Creative didn't mean criminal. But over the next week, the water level kept dropping faster than the summer heat alone could explain. So I set up a simple trail camera near the reservoir, more out of curiosity than actual suspicion. I wasn't expecting to catch anything dramatic. I figured maybe I'd see deer or a stray dog, something harmless explaining the disturbed grass. Instead, 3 days later, I found footage that made my blood run cold. Timestamp, 3:52 a.m. A truck backing slowly down the slope toward my reservoir's edge, headlights off. A woman stepping out, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this before. She dragged a long hose from the truck bed, dropped one end directly into my water, and started a portable pump. I paused the footage, zooming in on her face. I didn't recognize her personally, but I recognized the sticker on her truck's back window immediately, a small, unmistakable HOA logo. Ridgemont Estates Homeowners Association. I sat there staring at that frozen frame for a long time, feeling something shift from confusion into pure, focused anger. Someone from that subdivision hadn't just trespassed once out of desperation. They'd built an entire routine around stealing water from land that wasn't theirs at an hour specifically chosen because nobody would ever be awake to catch them. I checked the camera's timestamp history. This wasn't the first time. The footage showed the same truck, same woman, same routine, going back nearly 2 weeks. 14 nights, 14 separate thefts, quietly draining my private reservoir while I slept 20 yards away, completely unaware. I picked up my phone that morning and did something I probably should have done the moment I noticed the tire tracks. I called the county sheriff's department to report water theft. But before I could even finish explaining the situation, the deputy on the phone asked me something that made my stomach turn. "Wait," he said, "did you say Ridgemont Estates? We've actually gotten a complaint from them too, about someone stealing water from their community pond. I nearly laughed out loud. A complaint from Ridgemont Estates about someone stealing water from their pond. The same week, I'd caught one of their own residents stealing from mine. That's interesting, I said carefully, because I have footage of one of your residents stealing from my private reservoir. 14 separate nights, according to my trail camera timestamps. There was a pause on the line. Can you send that footage over? We'll need to sort out exactly what's happening here. I sent the deputy everything that same afternoon. Full video clips, timestamps, close-up screenshots of the woman's face and her truck's license plate. Within an hour, he called back, voice noticeably more serious than before. We ran the plate, he said. Truck's registered to a Denise Hargrove. Ring any bells? It didn't, not personally, but something about the name felt oddly familiar, like I'd seen it somewhere recently without really paying attention. Then it clicked. Denise Hargrove. I'd seen that name on a laminated flyer stapled to the community bulletin board at the little country store down the road, the one advertising an upcoming Ridgemont Estates annual HOA meeting listing board members by name. Denise Hargrove, HOA president. I sat back, feeling the full weight of that realization settle in. This wasn't some random homeowner desperate enough to break rules during a drought. This was the person supposedly responsible for enforcing rules, quietly breaking the most basic, one of all, don't steal from your neighbors, while somehow also filing a complaint about someone stealing from her own community's pond. I called my neighbor, the older guy who'd first mentioned Ridgemont Estates to me, and told him what I'd found. He went quiet for a moment before responding. That actually makes a disturbing amount of sense, he said. Rumor around here is their community pond's been mysteriously low too. People blamed the drought. Guess maybe the drought had some help. That's when something even more unsettling occurred to me. If Denise was stealing from my reservoir at 4 a.m., and her own community's pond was also mysteriously dropping, was she stealing from her own neighbors too, filling her personal pool, her garden, whatever she needed from a supply meant for the entire community, all while publicly enforcing strict water restrictions on everyone else? I mentioned this theory to the deputy on our next call. He didn't confirm anything directly, but his tone shifted into something more careful, more procedural. We're going to need to expand this investigation, he said. If there's a pattern involving multiple water sources, that changes things significantly. 2 days later, county investigators visited Ridgemont Estates directly, reviewing their own community pond's water usage logs, interviewing residents about restriction compliance, cross-referencing complaints filed over the past several weeks. What they found didn't just confirm my suspicion. It confirmed something far worse. Denise hadn't just been stealing from my reservoir. She'd been secretly siphoning water from Ridgemont Estates' own community pond for weeks, filling a private above-ground pool she'd installed in her backyard, completely hidden behind a tall privacy fence, invisible from the street, invisible from casual inspection, but glaringly obvious once investigators actually looked with intention, all while publicly threatening fellow residents with HOA fines for even minor water restriction violations. One neighbor had received a $200 fine for watering a single flower bed during restricted hours. The same week Denise had been running an entire pool full of stolen water 20 feet from her own back porch. I sat there absorbing this information, feeling something shift from simple anger into something closer to disbelief. This wasn't just theft anymore. This was someone using a position of authority specifically to punish others for the exact behavior she'd been secretly engaging in herself, at a scale most residents couldn't even imagine. And the investigators weren't finished yet, because buried within Ridgemont Estates' own community meeting minutes, something else surfaced, something that suggested this pattern of behavior wasn't new at all. It had apparently been happening for years. Years isn't a word you want attached to water theft, but that's exactly what the investigating deputy told me during our next call, voice heavy with the kind of frustration that comes from uncovering something bigger than expected. We pulled Ridgemont Estates HOA, meeting minutes going back 4 years. He said, there's a recurring pattern of complaints about mysteriously low pond levels during dry spells every single summer, going back to right around when Denise Hargrove first became board president. For years, not one desperate summer during an unusually harsh drought. For consecutive years of quietly stealing water while blaming it on nature, while she publicly enforced restrictions that punished everyone but herself. I mentioned this to my neighbor, who wasn't even remotely surprised anymore. That tracks with something else I remember. He said, a guy who lived out there a few years back got fined heavily for filling a small kiddie pool for his grandkids during a restriction period. Ended up moving out of the neighborhood entirely because of how aggressively she pursued the fine, even threatened legal action if he didn't pay immediately. A children's kiddie pool. Fined aggressively enough that a family moved away entirely. Meanwhile, Denise had been secretly filling her own full-sized above-ground pool with stolen water year after year, hiding it behind a privacy fence specifically designed to keep anyone from noticing. The investigation expanded further. Word had apparently spread through Ridgemont Estates faster than the HOA could control, and residents who'd previously stayed quiet about their own suspicions suddenly felt emboldened to come forward. One woman reported noticing Denise's water bill seemed unusually low compared to her visible water usage, something she'd mentioned casually years ago but never pursued, assuming it wasn't her business. Another resident, a retired plumber, mentioned he'd once noticed an unusual pipe modification near Denise's property line, something that could theoretically allow water diversion from the community system, though he dismissed it at the time as none of his concern. Piece by piece, a much larger picture started forming, not just water theft from my private reservoir, but potentially years of systematic diversion from Ridgemont Estates' own community supply, hidden behind aggressive public enforcement specifically designed to distract from her own private violations. The investigators requested a full water usage audit comparing Denise's official municipal billing records against her property's actual physical water consumption, estimated through visible usage like her lawn, garden, and now-discovered pool. The numbers didn't add up. Not even close. According to her municipal billing, Denise's household used roughly the same modest amount of water as any typical suburban home. But her property's actual visible consumption, full green lawn during a drought when everyone else's grass had gone brown, a full swimming pool, an apparently thriving garden, suggested usage several times higher than what she was officially paying for, which meant the missing difference had to be coming from somewhere else entirely. My reservoir, the community pond, possibly other sources investigators hadn't even identified yet. I sat with that information for a long time, feeling something shift again, from anger into something closer to genuine unease. This wasn't a woman who'd made one impulsive bad decision during a stressful drought. This was someone who had built an entire system sustained over years, specifically designed to take what she needed from everyone around her while making sure nobody else got the same freedom. The county scheduled a formal hearing 2 weeks later, combining the water theft charges for my property with the expanding investigation into Ridgemont Estates' own community supply. I received a certified letter confirming my required attendance as the property owner whose reservoir had first exposed the entire pattern. But the day before that hearing, something happened that I genuinely didn't expect. Denise showed up at my property, alone, unannounced, standing at the edge of my driveway like she'd rehearsed exactly what she wanted to say. "We need to talk," she said, "before tomorrow happens." I stood at the edge of my driveway, watching Denise Hargrove, the woman who'd stolen from my reservoir 14 nights in a row, the same woman apparently responsible for years of hidden theft from her own community, standing in front of me like she genuinely believed a conversation could undo everything the investigation had already uncovered. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I said. "Everything you need to say belongs in tomorrow's hearing." "Please," she said, and for the first time, her voice cracked slightly, losing the confident authority I imagined she'd carried for years as board president. "I know how this looks, but you don't understand the pressure I've been under. The board expects perfect compliance from everyone. If people saw me struggling too, saw me needing extra water, just like everyone else, I'd lose all credibility. So instead of asking for help like everyone else, I said, 'You decided stealing was easier than admitting you're human?'" She didn't answer that directly, which told me everything I needed to know. I can make this go away, she said instead, shifting tactics. I can pay you directly for the water. Whatever you think is fair. We don't need lawyers, hearings, any of this getting more complicated than it already is. This isn't about money, I said. This was never about money. It's about you standing in my private reservoir at 4 in the morning, stealing water while publicly fining your own neighbors for doing far less. It's about years of the same pattern happening to your own community, hidden behind that privacy fence you built specifically so nobody would notice. Her expression shifted again, something colder settling behind her eyes. You have no idea what you're about to do to my life, my family, my reputation in this community. You should have thought about that before you decided stealing was worth the risk, I said. 14 times for me. Who knows how many times from people who trusted you to protect their community, not exploit it. She left without saying anything else, climbing back into the same truck I'd watched on camera footage weeks earlier, driving away without looking back. The hearing the next day was packed, not just county officials and legal representatives, but dozens of Ridgemont Estates residents, many of whom I recognized from the flyers and neighborhood gossip that had spread since the investigation began. The evidence presented was overwhelming. My trail camera footage showing 14 consecutive nights of clear water theft. The county's expanded audit, revealing years of discrepancy between Denise's billed water usage and her property's actual consumption. Testimony from residents who'd been unfairly fined for minor violations while she secretly violated the same rules at a much larger scale. One resident's testimony stood out above all the others, the same family who'd been aggressively fined for filling a small kiddie pool for their grandchildren years earlier, forced to move away entirely because of how relentlessly Denise had pursued that fine. We left our home, the man said, voice tight with barely controlled anger, because we couldn't afford the fines she threatened us with. Meanwhile, she had a full-sized pool this entire time, filled with water she stole from all of us. The hearing officer's expression remained carefully neutral throughout, but I noticed several residents in the gallery visibly reacting, shaking their heads, some even in tears, absorbing the full scale of years of quiet betrayal from someone they'd trusted to protect their community's interests. By the end of that hearing, the consequences were laid out clearly. Formal criminal charges for water theft, both from my private property and the community system. Mandatory restitution, calculated based on years of estimated stolen usage, a number far higher than anyone in that room had expected. Immediate removal from her position as HOA board president, effective immediately, with a permanent ban from ever holding a board position again. But the most significant consequence came almost as an afterthought, mentioned briefly by the county attorney overseeing the case. Given the scale of the theft, combined with existing municipal code violations regarding unauthorized water diversion, Denise now faced not just fines, but potential property liens significant enough to threaten her ownership of the home she'd built that hidden pool behind in the first place. I watched her sit motionless as that final detail was read aloud, understanding finally settling over her expression. The very position she'd used to control and punish an entire community was about to cost her the one thing she'd apparently valued more than any of their trust, her home. 6 months after that hearing, I drove past Ridgemont Estates on my way into town and noticed something that made the entire story finally feel complete. A for sale sign planted firmly in the front yard of Denise Hardrove's house. The same house with the privacy fence hiding a pool she'd filled with years of stolen water. The same house she'd apparently valued enough to steal from an entire community, night after night, summer after summer, all to maintain an image of comfort she'd never actually been entitled to. The restitution ordered by the county, combined with mounting legal fees and the criminal conviction that followed, had made keeping that property financially impossible. She hadn't just lost her position of authority. She'd lost the very thing she'd broken the law repeatedly trying to protect. My reservoir, meanwhile, sat exactly as it always had. Quiet, undisturbed, finally free from mysterious water level drops and unexplained tire tracks near its edge. I still checked my trail camera, occasionally, more out of habit than actual concern, but the footage stayed exactly as boring and uneventful as it should have been from the very beginning. Ridgemont Estates elected an entirely new HOA board within 2 months of the hearing, residents specifically choosing people who'd never previously held positions of authority, hoping to avoid exactly the kind of unchecked power that had allowed Denise's behavior to continue undetected for years. Their new policies included something the community had apparently never had before: transparent, publicly available water usage reports for board members specifically, along with an independent audit process designed to prevent exactly the kind of quiet exploitation that had gone unnoticed for so long. I ran into that same family, the ones fined years earlier for their grandchildren's kiddie pool, at a community event a few months later. They'd apparently moved back into the area once word spread about the investigation's outcome, choosing a different neighborhood nearby, but close enough to reconnect with old friends who'd stayed behind through the entire ordeal. We almost didn't believe it when we heard, the woman said, shaking her head slowly. All those years, feeling like we'd done something wrong, moving away because we couldn't handle the shame of those fines. And the whole time, she was stealing more water than we ever could have used in a lifetime. I understood exactly what she meant. That's really what made this story different from a simple case of theft. It wasn't just about stolen water or unpaid restitution, or even the loss of a home. It was about years of quiet, systemic hypocrisy. Someone using a position specifically meant to protect a community, instead using it to punish others for behavior she engaged in herself, at a scale most people never could have imagined until someone finally caught it on camera. Sometimes the people who scream loudest about rules are the same people counting on nobody ever checking whether they follow those rules themselves. All it took was one quiet reservoir, one trail camera, and someone finally willing to ask an uncomfortable question that Denise Hargrove had spent years assuming nobody ever would. Where is all this water actually going? If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you might expose something even more shocking than stolen water.